to just talk a little bit about a story, share a story with you of teaching a snails investigation with kindergartners that we did in Northern California before COVID. So this was an in-person lesson, but we think there are aspects of this classroom story that you'll find useful in an online virtual teaching environment. And I also want to mention that even though this is the kinder example, the strategies can be applied in multiple grade levels. So we want to focus a little bit on the science and engineering practice of analyzing and interpreting data and how that supports not only sense making in science, but it also supports math skills. And then we want to talk about the connection that a lot of you have already raised between close observation and students developing not only their science skills, but their writing skills, their literacy skills. And what I'd like to invite you to do as I share this story is to put in the chat box any reactions or comments or questions as they come up so that this can be as interactive as possible. And Kelsey, if you can put the next slide up. I'm going to share with you a little bit. This is an expository text that we co-created in the classroom. So first with the kids, we observed snails and we focused on their body parts and what they did. So we did a lot of observing the snails. We did this live, but you could do it like how Fred did, where you have a camera and are showing a live snail, or you could show a video like how Kelsey did. And we spent a lot of time talking about what we were seeing. And then we created this shared text right here that talked about the body parts and what they did. And we had some disagreement on the tentacles and what they were. And so we used the book that Fred shared to round out our observations and get some clarity around the functions of some of the body parts that we weren't universally agreed upon. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how you could use this shared writing piece as a springboard to develop student skills in informative or explanatory texts. Their students are naming what they're writing about and they're supplying some information about the topic using words and diagrams. And that's what we have there, but you could take this and draw it into a longer book. So for example, in kindergarten, an interactive writing lesson could be having each page on a different body part, and the text could be really repetitive, such as I see the shell, I see the eye. And then later on in the year, students might have a more complex sentence. This is the shell. It is for blank, protection. And they could even revisit the same text and expand it with more detail and more sophistication throughout the year. Kelsey, if you put the next slide up, let's show a little bit of an example of how you might take an experience like this to develop narrative writing, whether it's the teacher modeling. Let's say you have a workshop model and you're doing a mini lesson where you're modeling some writing before the kids are asked to engage in it, or it might be interactive writing. And with kinder, maybe you're using it to develop the idea of a small moment. So focusing our writing on something very small. Or you could use it with another aspect of narrative writing, such as starting with a hook. You might go back to it in a later lesson to add more science-specific vocabulary or edit for punctuation and spelling. Or you might revise the pictures, add more detail to the pictures and more text to the pictures, which will then help us add more detail to the text and the writing below. And all of that connects to careful observation in science. Let's just show the next slide so we can see an example that's more like mid-year first grade. This could be an interactive writing session where a small moment is developed to focus on showing, not telling with details. So we're really using details to give the reader a visual image of what happened when we watched the snail. You could use this as an interactive editing piece in a later lesson and ask students to help you edit for word choice. So in the second picture, you can see slowly is used twice. What words could we use besides slowly? Maybe even go back and observe our snails again to generate more vocabulary that we could use. And I just want to say that some teachers I've seen or talked to have done a mini lesson like this interactively during a class meet using a document camera. We got lots of examples before about how you could do shared writing on a Google Doc or in an interactive way with a Jamboard. You could use photos from a snail that you had, or if you didn't want to live draw the pictures, or you could draw things and add them as choices for the students to help use to illustrate the work. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide here. And I want to just talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty in the classroom when we did this with young students, because some of these ideas may be helpful or useful for you to think about. When we worked with the kindergarten students, we started with observing the snails closely, and that raised many, many questions, just as it did with you. And we chose one as a class to investigate further. What foods do snails eat? And you could do this like just how you did it online this morning. We had the students have a little mini lesson where they brainstormed different foods they wanted to test. And from that list, I brought in a range of foods. And we had each a table mat like the one on the left-hand side for each table group, which was 4 students. And this was just a laminated piece of paper, and the snails went on those little circles in the center. So each mat had 2 snails. And then you can see there's a little X by those. And on each X, a student got to choose a food to put it on the X. And so there was different food on each X. And each student was responsible for tracking the number of times the snail went to his or her food. We also gave the student a picture of the food that they chose when they took it off the plate, and I'll explain why we did that a little bit later. But we wanted to have a visual representation of what food it was that the kids at each table collected. And so you'll see also there's a number chart there. This was September, and so not all of the kids were able to have one-to-one number correspondence to count to 10. So on this number chart, each time the snail took a bite of their food, they could mark off the next sequential number on their chart and then put the snail back in the circle in the center. And therefore they could track whether the snail came to a particular food more than one time, no times. They had some quantitative data that they could use. And because we had spent a lot of time talking about the body parts and their functions, the students were really readily agreed that how we were going to tell if a snail ate something was if we saw its mouth moving when it was on the food, or if we saw bite marks on the food. So those were the 2 pieces of evidence that we were looking for as we investigated. And then after the investigation, we asked the students to, we cleared off the food, went to recess, came back from recess. We asked them to look at the number chart and determine as a group, which food did the snail go to the most? And they circled that food item on their chart. And so we then used those food pictures and their mats to actually build a data chart. And you can see in the next picture that, well, if you can't see, I'll tell you, this is a T-chart with the food on the left-hand side said food that snails did eat. On the left side was foods they did not eat. And on the column where we put the food that snails did eat, we put the one that they ate the most first. So the circled item was first. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the math connection here. This was an interactive chart that we built. And you could do it that way, or you know, depending on how you organized collecting the data with your class as you're doing it, whether a synchronous meet or they're looking at video, you could do some of this data collection and share it with them later. But we built the chart with each group's data, and we were talking the data as we built the chart. Oh, the lifesaver was the food that the snail ate the most, and sort of the metacognitive strategy of building the chart was helpful to the students. And then we had a science talk, and we used the prompts, what do you notice and what do you wonder? And that really were helpful prompts, because the kids noticed all sorts of details about this data. And right away, they were comparing data from different groups and realizing that not all of the snails had the same preferred food. And in fact, many snails ate many different kinds of food. And I want to talk a little bit about this math connection, because I take a lot of classes from Jo Boaler, who's a math professor out of Stanford. And I think a lot of teachers here might be familiar with U Cubed. And she's just had a huge impact on my teaching. And in the class I'm taking from her right now, she's talking about how she's on the group of educators revising the math framework for California that's coming out next year. And that the framework is going to focus on two types of mathematics: number sense and data analysis, what she calls data science. And one of the biggest points she's making in this class is that students should be regularly working with data sets that are meaningful to them. And science, of course, provides a shared experience and a meaningful data set that helps kids with this really important aspect of mathematics. And the other thing I wanted to say that I really appreciated about her class, she's long been promoting number talks in mathematics. And she's now suggesting that teachers have data talks and incorporate that into their mathematics tool belt. And the questions she suggests using when students look at a data set are, what do you notice and what do you wonder? They're such simple questions, but they generate a huge amount of reflection and insight on the part of the students.